launched an investigation, but after Mr. Daly complained, they decided to take another look at it. And then in a statement this morning, the force said it had taken the decision to open an investigation after reassessing the information provided to them by that Tory MP. Now, we know Angela Rayner was registered as living at Vicarage Road in Stockport on the electoral roll until she sold that house in 2015, but she appears to have given two different addresses when she re-registered the births of two of her children in 2010 following her marriage to Mark Rayner. The other address listed is where her husband was registered as living, according to reports in the Mail on Sunday. And we've had weeks of chatty neighbours giving their version of events to some newspapers. Crucially, under electoral rules, voters are expected to register at their permanent address, and that seems to be the issue the police will now be probing. This clearly has caused, I think, irritable exasperation at the top of the Labour Party since they started rumbling along in February, but it's clearly been a big distraction from the things it does want to be talking about. Angela Rayner has previously said these stories are simply a smear by her Tory opponents, and this morning a Labour spokesman said Ms Rayner welcomed the chance to set out the facts with the police, and the party said it remains completely confident that Angela Rayner has complied with the rules.
Ben, thanks very much indeed. Ben Wright, our political correspondent there. So what are the rules around registering to vote? Peter Stanion is the Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
What are the rules when it comes to voter registration and electoral law?
Effectively, each individual should be shown as registered to vote at any address which they can demonstrate a reasonable degree of permanence. So, generally speaking, for most individuals, that's one property, but there are instances where a degree of permanence can be shown at more than one address.
And if that is all in the right place, forgive my sort of slightly sloppy language, how often is it that the police end up making investigations of electoral laws?
It will be on that. Very rarely will there be cases brought or investigations undertaken, because ultimately the individual making a factual statement is also required, if needed, by the electoral registration officer to provide sufficient evidence that the degree of permanence they're talking about at that address is enough to satisfy that requirement.
Well, so they will have already sort of shown the electoral registration officer that there's enough there to establish their residence, and there's very, very rarely any other case to answer. Is that what you're saying?
It applies across the board in that there's a declaration signed that I am to demonstrate that degree of permanence of address. It will then follow that if the registration officer has any doubts as to that, it will be, please provide me with the evidence to support that. And then following that, generally speaking, there may well be an investigation if attempted fraud or there are some inaccuracies in terms of the information provided.
Peter Stanion, thanks very much indeed for coming on The World at One. Coming up, the Commonwealth Games cost Birmingham dear, so why does Glasgow want to hold them? Do get in touch with us on social media, use the hashtag BBCWATO. Our email address is, as ever, worldat1@bbc.co.uk. The verdict on the Bank of England's economic forecasting, something that affects every one of us one way or another, is in, and it is not a happy one. The review, led by the former chair of the US Bank, found that underinvestment in software and modelling has led to a complicated and unwieldy system that limits the capacity of staff to undertake some useful analyses. The review followed some spectacular forecasting failures as inflation took off. The bank saw inflation at the end of 2022 as being 2.5%. That was its forecast. The actual figure was 10.7%. This was Andrew Bailey, governor of the bank, speaking in August 2021. He was asked why the bank wasn't raising rates despite rising inflation.
Because we've also projected that we think the increase in inflation is going to be temporary and it will unwind. And that the reasons that are causing it, which are really quite specific to the situation we find ourselves in this, obviously big, necessary and somewhat bumpy recovery from the COVID-induced economic impact, is going to be temporary. And as our projection that we published today shows, we think that inflation will come back to target, to the 2% target.
The forecasts are important, of course, because of the signals they send to other financial players about the way that interest rates might move, and because they're part of the way that interest rate setters at the bank make their decisions. So the stakes are pretty high. Marine Khan is economics editor at the Times newspaper. It's here to take us through what Ben Bernanke, the central bank governor, has come up with, former governor. Marine, good afternoon.
Hi.
Some pretty sweeping criticisms in this review. This wasn't just fiddling around the edges, was it?
No, it wasn't. And Dr. Bernanke, as he's known, had a very wide remit. He spent a couple of weeks in the bank, basically walking around the corridors, sitting in meeting rooms. He had over 60 meetings with people inside the bank, outside the bank, forecasters, to try and work out, one, what's the sort of institutional culture that the bank has, and two, where is it really falling short? And of course he has something to directly compare this against, because he used to run the world's most powerful central bank at a particularly difficult time during the financial crisis. And so I think the criticisms are very, very broad, but the recommendations, I think, pull their punches a little bit. That he's not asking for a complete revolution of the way the bank does its operations, but I think given the nature of the criticisms, the questions need to be that, well, if the bank wants to take these on, it will have to make major changes to the way it does things like forecasting and how it communicates to the public.
Is he looking, or has he looked, or does he criticise mainly the machinery of forecasting? There is quite a lot of talk about the software they use and the need for investment. Or is he also looking at the culture of forecasting and perhaps the groupthink that some have criticised the bank for?
Yeah, I think on both of those he has something to say. So there's a sort of slightly technical side, which is the model and all of the various inputs that go into the model, and all the staff who work on the model, and then it produces certain numbers, and then those numbers are poured over by the members of the Monetary Policy Committee. And Bernanke says that, one, he doesn't think the inputs are particularly strong, so some of the data is difficult to get hold of, it's very difficult to access, the software is not updated, and then the problem is also that some of the staff who are working on these models basically have to change their jobs every few years, and he's recommending that what the bank should do is make sure that staff are very experienced, so they don't have to get a tap on the shoulder saying it's time for you to move to another division. And if you keep people around long enough, the models should improve because there's a lot more institutional knowledge behind them. And then on the culture of the bank, he sort of points out that other central banks, perhaps more modern central banks in countries like Sweden and Norway, and even including his own US Fed, don't have this slightly antiquated practice of producing big reports. So these are over 200 pages every 3 months, which have loads of numbers in them. It makes it very difficult for the public to understand which are the important numbers. And he thinks the bank should perhaps become a bit more nimble, a bit less focused on the numbers, particularly when the numbers are so uncertain, and actually de-emphasize the importance of their forecast and instead try and communicate a stronger message to people. For example, what we might be hearing in the next couple of months, which is not the numbers, but that inflation is coming down, perhaps not specifically where and to what rate, and the bank will take action to reduce interest rates. So I think it's a very broad sweep, and now it's up to the bank to sort of pick and choose what they want to go ahead and implement.
Marine, thank you so much for coming on. Marine Khan there from the Times newspaper. Well, Harriet Baldwin is Member of Parliament and Chair of the Treasury Select Committee. She also called for this review to happen. She joins us now. Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon.
And what do you make of what you've seen so far?
Well, I think that this has been a very important piece of work by Dr. Ben Bernanke. As you say, our committee has called for this review. So we wrote to the chair of the Court of the Bank of England back in June 2023, and we said we think something may be wrong with these models. We'd like you to organise someone independent to have a look at these models. And it's worth bearing in mind that inflation is absolutely terrible. This has been terrible for our constituents that we've had this bout of inflation. It's the worst tax that you can have on any economy, and so it's incredibly important that the models that the Bank of England use to look ahead and see what's the forecast for inflation are as robust as possible. So we very much welcome this report today. We're looking forward to scrutinising the report in detail. We have Dr. Bernanke coming in front of our committee to give evidence next month. I think another important part of the work that he has published today is around the communication of the forecast. We have gone through a period of terrible uncertainty coming out of the pandemic and then with Putin's evil invasion of Ukraine, and just communicating how important it is to get inflation back to target is a key part of what a central bank needs to do, and for people to have confidence in that.
Some of your colleagues in your party have suggested that the bank has slightly deeper problems, deeper issues when it comes to forecasting. In particular, that they fall victim to groupthink, too many of the same kinds of people thinking the same kinds of things, and also that they don't make a link between what's called, the amount of money in the economy and inflation itself, so that they don't link those two things together. Do you have sympathy with their opinions?
Well, we've had panels of experts give evidence to our committee, and they have highlighted a range of different potential sources of error. I think it's worth recognising that all countries experience this bout of inflation, so there is an element of global inability to be able to deal with an energy price shock of this scale. But I do think that there were some particularly UK-based features that the Bank of England potentially can improve. And so I think that this very thorough report, which looks at the whole process as well as the communication around the forecast, is an incredibly useful piece of work, and I think it needs to be implemented.
I mean, forgive me for pressing on this point, but again, it is made by some of your colleagues that essentially the bank has the wrong kind of economists doing its thinking and its analysing for it. Do you think that is fair?
Well, I think, I very much respect the independence of the Bank of England. I think that has been important, and they have a wide range of people on the Monetary Policy Committee, some of whom have more of a monetarist focus than others, and there are 9 of them, and they come up with an independent vote each. So I think that it probably is less of a concern from my point of view, as some of the actual underlying problems in the modelling and just the time frame that the model looked like, it looked back at, which was a trailing 30 years and didn't look at the energy shock of the 70s, for example.
Harriet Baldwin, thank you so much for coming on the programme. Harriet Baldwin, they're the Conservative Chair of the Treasury Select Committee. Spare a thought as the rain comes down this spring for the British farmer. The near ceaseless downpours of the past few months have driven many farmers to despair as crops rot in sodden fields and livestock chews its way through ever more expensive feed. We heard earlier this week from Henry Ward, a farmer from Lincolnshire, whose farmhouse can, after endless rain, only be reached by boat, and whose fields are underwater.
It'll be an absolute mess. So my soil, which that land is grade 1 land, it's absolutely beautiful soil, it'll grow anything, but the soil will essentially be dead. So soil needs oxygen in it, so it's a living, breathing thing, soil is, but it'll be dead. It'll be anaerobic, it'll smell, all the worms will be dead, all the microbes in there will be dead, there'll be debris all over the farm, fences, everything else will be collapsed and ruined. It'll just look like a wasteland.
Well, the trouble on the farms is poised to become trouble at the table too. Vernon Mascarenhas is from New Covent Garden Markets, which supplies produce to restaurants and hotels. Last week he visited farmers in Evesham, where fields have also been underwater for months.
As far as my main farm was concerned, we've missed the first 3 sowings of the season, which means these crops, which should have come through in May, going to probably come through at the end of June. And the other thing that really is important is that when the English season ends at about end of September, mid-October, we then go on to the Spanish/European season. Now, the problem that we have here is there is extensive drought in Spain at the moment, to the extent that the crops that we should be relying on come through in late October, we are being told do not rely on these crops. All of that is going to be a really big issue come end of October. What will basically happen is that we will then start looking further than Spain for our imports, and that will drive the costs up massively. This season, cauliflower in our wholesale market fluctuate from 80p a cauliflower to £3.80, and that can happen within a week. And we have no control over that price.
Well, the National Farmers Union says that farmers need more help to adapt to climate change. Some are already trying. Tom Martin is a farmer in Cambridgeshire. He grows mainly cereals and oilseeds with some foodstuff for livestock. And he joins us now. Good afternoon, Tom.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
No, thanks very much for joining us. Can I ask you, you're already adapting to climate change. How?
Yes, well, I think farmers are right on the front line of climate change. It's very apparent as we look at our weather stations or check the rain gauge. There's lots of ways that I and many other farmers are adapting to climate change. We're really prioritising. It was great to hear Henry Ward's quote there talking about soil health. We're really prioritising soil health. On our farm, that means we're reducing our tillage as much as we can because that preserves the natural drainage of the soil and it means that our soil is more alive. And if we can increase things like our organic carbon in the soil, then we can help our crops be more resistant to climate change. We've seen a huge amount of rain of late. We've had a year's worth of rain in 6 months, and if we can increase our soil organic carbon by just 1%, that means we have our soils can store an extra 354,000 litres of water per hectare in the top 30 centimetres. So that's 354 tonnes per hectare of water to store extra.
Which sounds fabulous, but forgive me, how do you increase your soil's organic carbon?
Well, we use a lot of kind of regenerative means, which means we're using cover crops. So gardeners might know that as green manure. So when we're straight after harvest, we'll plant another crop that we might not harvest, but is there just to help the soil. That will of course be capturing carbon and cycling it into the soil. We use companion cropping. So when we're growing, for example, our oilseed rape, we'll grow other crops at the same time that will just be there for the benefit of the plant, for the soil. We're looking at different breeds of plants. And we're looking at just really elevating to a point of religiosity the value of our soil. We've only just got back onto the soil after a very wet winter. I wouldn't take my heavy machinery onto the field until the conditions are absolutely right. So it's just thinking about that soil first, and everything else flows from there.
You have touched on how we grow, but what about what we grow? Because again, there is talk, if what we think has been happening continues to happen, of some of the crops that we always expect to come out of British fields to become much more difficult to farm.
Yes, that's right. Well, it's the variability that really catches us out. But we are certainly looking to the future and looking at other crops. I know there's Well, that's right. No 2 years are the same. No 2 days seem to be the same at the moment. But of course, if we elevate our soil health, it can deal with hotter weather, it can deal with colder weather, it can deal with wet and with dry. So actually, if our soil is more resilient, if our farming systems are more resilient, then we can cope with hopefully whatever climate change throws at us. But of course, it's a medium to long-term thing. We're dealing with biology which changes and moves slowly. So it won't help us with the immediate challenges that we have of the wettest winter anyone can remember. But it will help us in the medium to long term.
Tom, thank you very much for coming on the programme, and very best of luck with the weeks to come. Tom Martin, their farmer from Cambridgeshire. Ukraine's parliament has passed a bill extending conscription to 25 and 26-year-old men. It's not just military hardware the country lacks, but also the manpower needed to fight off the Russian invasion. Ukrainian General Yuri Sodol told Parliament that Russian forces outnumber his by a multiple of 7 to 10.
Тому я до вас дуже прошу, прийміть цей закон.
I ask you, pass this law. We need it badly. We need it very much. We are holding the defences on the last breath. Pass this law and the armed forces will not let you down. Not only you, but the entire people of Ukraine.
Відновлювати територію нашої країни.
The new law was, unsurprisingly, a deeply divisive one. The military pressing for more recruits, the political leadership wary of squeezing a war-weary population too far. One key measure demanded by many troops and their families, release from duty after 3 years, was dropped. The concern of many commanders that losing experienced troops, just as Russia received fresh manpower, would be disastrous. Yarina, serving with the Ukrainian Marines since 2020. Her unit's still on tour. She's served without a break for 2.5 years, mostly on the front line. She's now in Kyiv on a temporary deployment where she has taken to see her 9-year-old daughter. I spoke to her earlier and I asked her first to describe the places where her units had been deployed.
As we are reconnaissance, we had surveys and took part in combats on very different cities and direction of front line. We started in Severodonetsk, then we were deployed to Mariupol region, so the most difficult combats we had in the north of Mariupol. Then we were sent to Bakhmut region, then we were in Slavyansk. And we defended Slavyansk. Then we took part in liberation of Liman and Yampil cities. We were also in Kharkiv direction for a couple months, and in the end we were relocated to Kherson. My company is there right now.
You and your company have seen some very, very hard fighting.
Yeah, we saw almost all front line. And we did have a break. No.
How is it when you do not have a break? I mean, our listeners, as you can imagine, don't really have much understanding of that. What is it like?
Most guys of my company, they are from Kherson region, so Russians occupied their houses, their homes. And we all were very motivated, and it is hard, but we understand that we have to put up with such a long tour of duty. Well, I can say that such long duration on the front line becomes your zone of comfort, I would say. You get used to loss, you get used to risk, you get used to wounds and exhaustion. You just get used to it, and it's difficult to come back to peaceful cities because it's like your life and your zone of comfort.
As you know, there is a lot of debate now about extending the time that people serve in the military beyond 3 years. What do you think about the decision that has to be made?
In my opinion, the only thing which is important is to name the certain time. It could be 36 months or 3 years. It's fine. It's as we have 4 times bigger enemy, and we have to fight to the last one of us. It's okay to have 3 years service, but it's important to have this period, because right now everyone who is mobilized could serve to the end of his life.
What do you think about those people in Ukraine who have not come forward to serve in the military?
The guys who didn't come forward, they have to make up their decision right now, because we still have time, and to come now, because if they didn't come forward, they would be mobilized for Russian army when we are occupied by Russians. That is the message which we try to give to all the society.
Do you understand their feelings, the feelings of the men who say they do not want to fight?
No, I don't understand them, because I can't imagine myself to live with such position in wartime when your country is occupied by such a big enemy and your favorite cities are destroyed. I can't understand how you can just stand aside and wait for someone else who would defend you.
And what about the idea of forcing women to serve?
I support the mobilization for women who are suitable for military service, yes, who can pass tests and other conditions, and I believe that women also have to be mobilized.
You are now away from the front line and you are able to see and look after your daughter. How do you feel about going back to the front line?
I'm planning that, actually. I understand that Russia will push us to the end, and I understand that after these 4 years I can take like a little break to be with my daughter, and after that I can come back to the front line and continue fighting, because it's what we have to do to save Ukraine.
That was Ukrainian Marine Yarina Shoronov. There is some good news for the rather beleaguered Commonwealth Games this morning. You may remember that the Australian state of Victoria rather abruptly withdrew its offer to host the sporting extravaganza in 2026 because of rising costs. Now, the organisation Commonwealth Games Scotland has stepped forward to say that Glasgow would host the Games in 2 years' time if no one else wants them. I paraphrase. Glasgow, of course, hosted the Games a decade ago. The question is, given the costs and what some say is the relatively low profile of the Games, why? Ian Reid is the chair of Commonwealth Games Scotland.
We are coming at this from the perspective that the Commonwealth Games is hugely important to Scottish sport. So much Scottish sport. The pathways, the infrastructure is linked to that being the elite competition for a number of our sports. It would have such disruption to our whole ecosystem if there were not an event.
Birmingham cost north of £700 million. How much would Glasgow cost?
So we are looking at a concept where we take the £100 million that's offered from the Commonwealth Games Federation.
Yeah.
We enhance that with the private money we would raise through ticket sales, through merchandise sales, through sponsorship, through broadcast, and we deliver an event that does not require public funding. And I know the next question, the obvious one, is, well, how can we go from those sort of numbers you've just described to numbers that look significantly less? So a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, some of those costs within Birmingham and in Glasgow are infrastructure related. We're really fortunate here in the city of Glasgow that all of that investment has been made back in 2014. We will select the sports programme and the concept based on what's available. So we're looking at a tight footprint, we're looking at venues that already exist, but we think we've got a concept that can be delivered for that amount of money. And that is not an insignificant amount of money.
Sure.
I know the comparison's easy to previous games. The Federation and any hosts, I think, are now aligned that things have to change. We know there's been a challenge. We know that they are struggling to find hosts because of the cost. So perhaps this is a reset that the event needs.
Alongside the fact that you've got the infrastructure in place and that you want a tighter footprint, which would presumably reduce costs, are you also talking about a rather leaner Games, perhaps with some of the sports that have been in previous Commonwealth Games not represented in 2026 if Glasgow takes hold of it?
We'll adapt the sports and the event to the venues that are there. And we're fortunate in Glasgow, as I said earlier, because we've got some really world-class venues. So that will likely mean a smaller sports programme. We have. Do you know what you might drop, Ian? We're still doing that work, so the discussions are ongoing. We want to make sure that we liaise closely with the international national federations to explain the concept, to get their feedback, and also to look at what works best in the local cities.
You've talked about the benefits for Scottish sport and Scottish sportsmen and women, and we've talked about the cost. Do you think there is a benefit for Glasgow and Scotland as well
We've got research from previous Commonwealth Games. We've got £100 million now coming into the city. The economic benefit of that from previous events has normally been a multiple of 1.5 to 2 times. So we could be up to £200 million of economic benefit into the city. We're going to have restaurants and bars full. People recognise that in this city from 2014. They will support it. This feels like an opportunity to invest in the city externally and actually grow the economy rather than it be a draw on the economy.
It's hard to escape the feeling that the brand and the event of the Commonwealth Games is a bit tarnished, even a bit tired. I mean, given the way that the Australian state of Victoria just sort of suddenly pulled out and said, you know what, it's just not worth it. You're not concerned you might be taking on something of a worn-out project?
I can only speak from my personal experience. I've been lucky enough to have been involved in delivering 2 Commonwealth Games in the UK and visiting others. And I always come back to this is a sport event that in Birmingham drew nearly 1.5 million people to go and watch in person and tens of millions to watch on television in the UK. I was lucky enough to be in Birmingham again this week at the Sport Accord Convention, which is a legacy from that event. The sporting world were there, and all you heard was how positive the impact had been in that city from the event.
That was Ian Reid, the chair of Commonwealth Games Scotland. There is a new paradox in the world of astrophysics, and it's born out of